Senior Chief Aaron Kovac had blood running past his elbow and dripping off his fingers when he pressed the transmit key and heard nothing come back. Not static, nothing. 12 men flattened against rock, 2 ridge lines above them, a medic bleeding out who couldn't treat himself, and a radio that had gone as quiet as a closed door. He said it out loud because somebody had to. "We're so dead." 11 men heard him say it. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now and stay with this story all the way to the end, because what happens next, nobody in that gorge saw coming. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. 9 hours earlier, Lieutenant Wren Calloway was mopping a hangar floor. She was 25 years old. She had dark blonde hair that never quite held a shape, pulled back into a ponytail that had gone loose sometime around the second hour, and that she had stopped fixing. Olive drab t-shirt, camouflage utility trousers, boots that had been resoled twice. She was moving a mop across concrete in long, even strokes, and she was doing it well, because she did everything well, and because doing it badly would have given somebody a reason to say something to her. And she had decided 3 weeks ago that she was not going to give anybody a reason for anything ever again. She was on administrative stand-down, day 19. Nobody at Naval Air Station Halloran Point would say out loud what the stand-down was for. The paperwork said pending review of aircrew currency documentation, which was a sentence built specifically to mean nothing. What it actually meant was that 22 days ago, Lieutenant Calloway had walked into the maintenance control office with a folder and a set of dates and pointed out that 4 separate airframes had been signed off as inspected on days when the inspector in question had been on leave in another time zone. She had not raised her voice. She had not gone to anyone's superior first. She had put the folder on the desk of the officer whose signature block sat at the bottom of the routing chain and said she assumed it was a clerical thing and that he'd want to fix it before it became something else. Lieutenant Commander Curtis Meade had thanked her. He had genuinely, warmly thanked her. He had told her that this was exactly the kind of attention to detail the command needed more of. He had walked her to the door with a hand near her shoulder without ever touching it, and he had said twice that he was glad she'd come to him directly. 3 days later, she was grounded. Not for the folder, officially for a currency lapse, an annual qualification that had, according to the system, expired 11 days prior. Wren had flown twice in those 11 days. Both flights had been logged. Both logs had been entered into a system that Meade's shop administered. She had gone to look for them, and they were simply not there anymore, and the person who would have investigated, that was the person who had made them not be there. And Wren had stood in a hallway with that understanding sitting in her chest like something swallowed wrong, and had realized fully and coldly that she had lost before she knew she was playing. So she mopped the floor. 19 days. Here is the part nobody at Halloran Point understood about her, and the part that would matter more than anything else before the night was over. She wasn't sulking. She wasn't waiting it out. She had made peace with the mop on day 2. What she had not made peace with, and what she worked on every single evening in a room nobody checked, was the ground. Because Wren Calloway did not think of herself as a pilot who happened to know some terrain. She thought of herself as a person who knew terrain and happened to have an aircraft. And there was one piece of terrain in the entire archipelago that she knew better than any living human being. And she had never told a single person at that base how she knew it. At 11:40, she walked into a mission brief she had not been invited to. She did it because she had seen the routing on a whiteboard through a doorway on her way past, and because the routing ran a foot patrol through the eastern approach of Ravenglass Gorge on a late afternoon schedule, and because there was a specific fact about Ravenglass Gorge in the late afternoon that she was fairly sure nobody in the room knew. 12 SEALs and 4 staff officers turned around when the door opened. She was in the olive t-shirt and the camo trousers. No flight suit, no patch, no reason on earth to be standing there. She knew exactly how she looked. She had thought about it in the hallway for 4 seconds and had decided that looking stupid was cheaper than staying quiet, which was a calculation she had made once before in her life and gotten wrong by 4 minutes. "Sir," she said to Meade, "your patrol window puts them in the throat between 1700 and 1900. Meade smiled at her. That was the thing about Meade. He smiled first always, and the smile was warm and unhurried, and it made every subsequent word land as reasonable. "The throat," he said. "That's Ravenglass. That's what the aircrew call it. That's what I call it. And what's the concern, Lieutenant?" She told them, She told them that the ice field to the northwest dumped cold air down the shoulder of the gorge in pulses that the pulses didn't show on the forecast product because the forecast product sampled at rim altitude, and the phenomenon lived below the rim that between roughly 1700 and 1900 in this part of the season, the katabatic flow set up hard enough to make rotary wing extraction from the gorge, floor, a coin flip, and fixed wing support below the rim functionally impossible for anyone who hadn't flown it. She said that the corridor was a place where you could put men in and then discover you had no mechanism to take them out. The room was quiet while she said it. Not respectfully quiet, the other kind. Meade let it for a beat and a half. He was very good at the beat and a half. Lieutenant Calloway, he said, how many hours do you have in theater? 410. And how many of those are combat sorties as opposed to depot ferry and functional check flights? She didn't answer because he already had the number and everybody knew he already had the number, and because the truthful answer was one that could be made to sound like almost nothing if you shaped it correctly, and he was going to shape it correctly. Because my understanding, Meade said pleasantly, is that you are at this moment not qualified to fly at all. And I don't say that unkindly. I say it because we have 12 operators in this room who need to hear weather from a meteorologist, terrain from an intel shop, and risk from the people who carry the risk. Not from and here he did something with his hand, an apologetic little gesture, not from a taxi driver in a flight suit. And you're not even wearing the flight suit. Somebody laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter. That was the thing that got under her ribs and stayed there. It was easy laughter, the kind men make in a room when someone has broken a small tension neatly, and it went around the table and touched almost everybody. And Wren stood there in her olive t-shirt with her loose ponytail and let it go over her like weather. Almost everybody. Senior Chief Aaron Kovac did not laugh. Kovac was 41 gray, coming in at the temples, 11 years of this, and he was looking at her the way you look at a gauge that's reading something you don't like. He had heard the specificity in what she said. Katabatic pulses sample altitude rotary extraction as a coin flip that was not somebody repeating a weather brief. That was somebody who had been there. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. And then he looked back down at his notebook and said nothing at all. That was the moment, not the laughter. Kovac would come back to this exact 2 seconds for the rest of his life, and he would come back to it with a specific and permanent nausea because he had known and knowing had cost him nothing, and he had spent it on nothing. Thank you, Lieutenant, Meade said. We'll take it under advisement. She left. She did not go back to the mop. She went to a supply annex on the north side of the field where she had a folding table and a chart case that nobody had ever asked her about, and she opened the case and she took out a chart of Ravenglass Gorge that was not a Navy product. It was hers. She had drawn it. There were 11 overlays. There were wind vectors marked at 4 altitudes and 3 times of day with confidence notations in her own shorthand. There were rock formations annotated by shape and by how they behaved acoustically. There were 24 points marked with a symbol that meant cover for 1 man and 9 marked with a symbol that meant cover for 4. There was a line down the center of the gorge floor with elapsed times written along it in minutes, and the times were not flight times. They were walking times. She sat with the chart for a while, and she did what she had done every day for 19 days, which was to add to it. She had a new observation from the previous week about how the pulse behaved when it hit the eastern bulge, and she wrote it down carefully in the margin. And while she was writing it, her hand was steady and her chest was not. Because Meade had been wrong about her in a way that was funny and right about her in a way that was not. Not from the people who carry the risk. She was not going to think about that. She had a rule about not thinking about that. She thought about it anyway. She always did eventually, and it always arrived the same way, not as a memory, but as a number. 4 minutes. 2 years ago, in a different place with a different call sign, Wren Calloway had been 4 minutes late. There had been a man on the ground named Teague Corman, 28, who liked terrible coffee and had a laugh you could hear through a bulkhead, and there had been a hold placed on her launch by a duty officer who was following the checklist correctly, and there had been 4 minutes, and at the end of those 4 minutes, there had been a rock face with something on it that used to be Teague. She had never said his name out loud since. Not once, not in the debrief where she had said the priority casualty, not to the chaplain who had waited, not to her sister on the phone. She had done something else instead. She had gone out and started learning ground. Not because it fixed anything. It fixed nothing. But because a person can only carry a specific kind of grief by turning it into a specific kind of preparation, and Ren had understood at 23, sitting in a room with her hands flat on a table, that she was never going to be able to stop the world from putting men in bad places. The only thing she could control, the only thing was whether when they were in one, she was already the person who knew the way in. She had told nobody that. It sounded insane out loud. It sounded like a woman building a cathedral out of guilt. So she kept it in a chart case in a supply annex, and she mopped the floor. And at 11:40, she had walked into a room and offered the single most valuable piece of information at Halloran Point. And a man had made a joke about a taxi driver, and 12 operators had laughed. At 16:10, Bravo Element stepped off. Nobody called it a mission. They called it a walk. The routing was a coastal presence patrol along the eastern rim and down through the lower gorge. The kind of task you hand to an experienced element when the actual work is elsewhere, and somebody needs a line item that says the area was covered. Kovac had run it 8 times in 14 months. Twice at night, once in weather that made the last 2 miles genuinely unpleasant. Nothing had ever happened. Petty Officer Second Class Ili Marchetti was 23 and had been on the team for 7 months and was carrying more water than he needed because he had been made fun of once for carrying too little. He was walking forth. He was thinking about a girl in Norfolk who had stopped answering. He was, by his own later admission, bored. Petty Officer First Class Danny Okonkwo was the medic, 29, and he was walking 6th, and he had a photograph in his left breast pocket of a 4-year-old named Junie holding a plastic dinosaur like a trophy. He touched the outside of the pocket about once an hour without noticing he was doing it. He had a habit on patrols like this one of narrating the terrain quietly to himself in a running deadpan, and 3 or 4 of the guys had learned to walk near him just to hear it. At 1826, Okonkwo said something about the scree slope that made Marchetti laugh out loud. At 1834, the first belt-fed weapon opened up from the North Ridge Line. Here is what took 90 seconds. Kovac's element had eyes on 4 individuals on the eastern approach when the shooting started, and the 4 individuals were not the problem. The 4 individuals were a fixed point that everybody's attention had gone to, which was the entire purpose of the 4 individuals. The actual problem was on both ridgelines simultaneously in prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire that covered the only 2 pieces of ground in the lower gorge where a 12-man element would naturally go to cover. They were not surprised. They had been waiting, and they had been waiting in the right places. Kovac understood this in the first 8 seconds, and he understood it before he understood anything else, and the understanding arrived as a specific physical sensation in his stomach, because a man with 11 years does not need to reason his way to this was set up. He simply knows the difference between people who found you and people who were expecting you. He got 7 men behind the western bulge. That was luck, and it was also the only thing he did right in the first minute, and he would say so later. Okonkwo went down at second 41. He went down first. The medic. Out of 12 men moving in a strung-out file across broken ground with 2 elevated positions and 30-plus shooters and 100 meters of frontage, the first man they put on the deck was the one carrying the blood kits. Kovac saw it happen, and he heard himself say a word he did not remember choosing. Then he was moving, and Marchetti was moving with him, because Marchetti didn't know enough yet to know he shouldn't. And the 2 of them got Okonkwo by the drag handle and got him 20 feet that felt like a mile. And when they got him behind, Rock Kovac put his hand on the inside of Danny's thigh and felt the pressure come up against his palm in a rhythm. And the rhythm was the wrong rhythm. And Kovac knew exactly what that meant because Okonkwo had taught him what it meant during a class in a hangar bay 14 months ago. Femoral. Danny. Kovac had his knee on it and his whole weight behind the knee. Danny, talk to me, what am I doing? Okonkwo's eyes came around. He was already gray at the mouth. And he did the thing that Kovac would tell exactly 2 people about for the rest of his life, which was that Danny Okonkwo, with his own femoral artery open, looked down at Kovac's hands and started teaching. Higher, he said, not the wound, higher, above it. His voice was thin, but it was flat and it was steady, the same voice he used in the hangar bay. Tourniquet, high and tight. You're going to think it's too high. Go higher than that. Windlass until you can't turn it, then 1 more. Danny, 1 more turn, senior, then you leave. Then you go do your job. Kovac did it. He got the tourniquet on, and he turned the windlass until the plastic creaked, and then he turned it one more time, and Okonkwo made a sound that Marchetti heard from 4 feet away and did not forget, and then Okonkwo said, "Good," and closed his eyes. At second 88, Kovac keyed his radio and called it in as a full ambush priority casualty, 2 elevated positions requesting immediate close air support and casualty evacuation. At second 90, the shooting rate on the North Ridge changed, got slower, more deliberate, more economical, and Kovac's stomach dropped a second time. They were conserving. People who conserve ammunition are people who intend to be there a while. Back at Halloran Point, the call came into operations at 1836, and the room did what rooms do. The duty officer pulled the grid. The watch team started the call out. Somebody put the weather product on the big screen, and somebody else put up the alert roster, and within 4 minutes, the operations floor had assembled a complete and accurate picture of a problem it could not solve. The nearest authorized fixed-wing asset was 52 minutes out at best speed, and that was before routing around the front that was already stacking against the ice field. Rotary assets could stage at the rim in 26, but could not descend into the gorge in the current wind regime without an unacceptable probability of losing an aircraft with a crew of 4 plus whoever they were carrying. Nothing on the ramp at Halloran Point was armed, fueled, and released. Nothing except one aircraft that was technically impounded and one pilot who was technically not a pilot. Nobody said that out loud in the first 10 minutes. Nobody thought of it because the aircraft was on the maintenance line with a red tag on the boarding ladder, and the pilot was somewhere on the base with a mop. Captain Edward Hartigan, the air boss, arrived at 1841. 58 years old, a career built brick by brick out of doing things in the right order. He looked at the timeline on the screen for a long moment and asked the only question worth asking, which was how long the element on the ground had. The answer came back from the medical officer as a range, and the range was 6 to 9 minutes for the priority casualty and indeterminate for everybody else, with the word indeterminate doing an enormous amount of work. And Lieutenant Commander Curtis Meade, who had come in at 1839, who had been the first staff officer on the floor, who had his sleeves rolled and a headset on, and who looked to every single person in that room like a man rising to a moment, began calmly and reasonably, and with real apparent pain in his voice, to explain why nothing could be sent. He was very good. He talked about the wind regime. He talked about the loss of a second aircraft compounding the problem. He talked about the responsibility they had to the air crew as well as the ground element. He used the phrase, "I want to send something more than anyone in this room," and he sounded like he meant it. And at 1847, he said to Hartigan directly that in his professional assessment, there was no responsible option, and that he was prepared to put that in writing. I was stalling. He was stalling in the most defensible way a human being has ever stalled, by being right about every individual fact while being catastrophically wrong about the whole, and there was exactly one person on that base who would ever figure out why. She was standing in a doorway on the far side of the operations floor with a mop bucket beside her because she had been swabbing the passage outside when the call-out went out, and she had heard the grid reference and she had stopped moving. Ravenglass. Wren stood in that doorway for 4.5 minutes and did not move a muscle. And in those 4.5 minutes, she listened to 15 people build with total professionalism and complete good faith an airtight case for letting 12 men die. She heard no responsible option. She heard 52 minutes. She heard the medical officer say 6 to 9. And then she heard Hartigan say the words she had been waiting 19 days and 2 years to hear somebody say. And he said it quietly, the way men say things they hate. Then it's impossible. Tell them we're working it and keep telling them. Wren Calloway set down the mop. She would think about that afterward, that it was the mop she remembered setting down, not the decision, because there hadn't been a decision. There was no moment where she weighed anything. She had been ready for this for 2 years. She had been ready in a way that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the fact that she had already run this exact scenario in her head several hundred times in a supply annex with a chart on a folding table. And when a person has done that, what looks from the outside like an instant of extraordinary resolve is on the inside just recognition. Oh, she thought, it's this one. She was already walking. Scone. She did not go to Hartigan. She would explain that later, and nobody would fully accept the explanation. But the explanation was true. Hartigan would have had to say no, because Hartigan was a man who said what the situation required, and the situation required no. And once he said it out loud, he would have had to enforce it. She was not going to make him do that. She went to the flight line. There were two A-10s at Halloran Point, and one of them was in pieces. The other one was hers for 2 years, the same airframe, the same cockpit, the same 11 small imperfections. She knew the way. You know a person's walk from behind, and it was sitting on the maintenance line with a red tag hanging off the boarding ladder, an aviation machinist's mate first class Marisol Duke, standing under the left wing with a flashlight in her teeth. Duke was 34. She had been Wren's crew chief for 2 years. She had over those 2 years formed a private and unshakable opinion about Lieutenant Calloway that she had never once expressed to another human being, and the opinion was this: that woman is going to do something someday, and I want to be standing next to the airplane when she does. She took the flashlight out of her teeth when she saw Wren coming across the ramp in the olive t-shirt at a walk that was not a walk. No, Duke said. Mari, I know what happened. I've got the net on, and no. Duke put her hand flat on the boarding ladder, which was considered honestly the least effective barricade in aviation history. Because you're grounded, and because that red tag is a real tag, and because I'm not going to be the one who... What's the tag for Duke stopped? What's the tag for Mari? There was a pause of maybe 2 seconds, and in it, Duke did the arithmetic that everybody in this story was going to have to do eventually at their own pace in their own way. Left engine thermal sensor, she said. Intermittent. It's been intermittent for 11 days, and it reads hot on spool up about 1 time in 6, and then it comes right. Failure rate on that sensor model. You already know it. Say it anyway. 92% it's the sensor, Duke said. 8% it's the engine. Wren put her hand on the ladder just below Duke's. 8% doesn't change what I have to do, she said. It changes what happens to me while I'm doing it. And that was it. That was the entire conversation. Duke stood there for 1 more second with her hand on the rung, and then she took it off and she walked around to the nose and started pulling chocks. And she did not look back up because she did not entirely trust her own face. You never saw me, Wren said, climbing. Ma'am, I'm going to say I saw you, Duke said. Every bit of it, in writing, but I'm going to say it after. She ran the start sequence from memory with her hands moving faster than her attention, which was a thing you could only do with an airframe you had lived in, and the engines came up and the left one spooled clean. 1 time in 6, she thought. Not this time, thank you. Tower came on before she'd even asked because Tower could see her on the ramp with a red tag on the ladder and her canopy coming down. Aircraft on the maintenance line. This is Halloran Tower. You are not say your call sign. Tower Storm 01 requesting immediate taxi and departure runway 08 emergency support of Bravo element in Ravenglass. Storm 01 negative. You are not on the flying schedule. There is no mission for that aircraft tonight, and I am showing that airframe on a maintenance hold. Shut down and remain in position. She looked at the clock. The medical officer had said 6 to 9 minutes at 1841. It was 1853. That number was already gone. That number had been gone before she reached the ramp. There was no version of this where she got there in time by the arithmetic that had been read out on the operations floor, which meant that either Okonkwo was already dead or somebody on the ground had done something the medical officer's model didn't account for, and Wren had spent enough years around men like Kovac to know which way to bet. Tower, she said, and her voice did not go up and did not harden. It just arrived very clearly the way a line arrives when somebody draws it on purpose. In about 11 minutes, the pulse sets up in that gorge, and after that, nothing goes in below the rim until morning. I am the only person at this command who has ever been down in the throat. I'm asking once. Storm 01 I cannot authorize. Then don't. She released the brakes. No. Down in the gorge at 1854. Senior Chief Aaron Kovac was doing the only thing left to do, which was moving his people west across ground that would not permit it while trying to keep a man alive who was not going to stay alive. Marchetti had 11 rounds. He knew he had 11 rounds because he had been counting them out loud, which he did not know he was doing. He had been doing it since about minute 6. Every time he fired, he said the number quietly on an exhale. 14, 13, 12, and Petty Officer Reyes, 4 feet to his left, had heard every single one and had not said anything about it because there was nothing to say about it. And because Reyes had noticed that his own hands had stopped shaking around the time Marchetti's counting started, which was the sort of thing about human beings that you could not design and could not explain. 11, Marchetti said. Kovac had already tried Command 4 times. Command kept telling him they were working it. He had stopped believing that at 1848, and he had stopped saying so at 1850 because the men could hear him. He got them behind the western bulge, all of them. Okonkwo dragged the last 30 feet by Marchetti and Reyes with his tourniquet biting, and he did a count and got 12, and for about 40 seconds, he let himself feel something close to competence. Then he put his hand down on the ground to push himself up, and his palm came down on metal. It was the edge of a crate, half buried in the scree wedged where a slide had put it, and it was not a rock, and it was not debris. It was a shipping crate with corner banding on it and a stencil across the top that Kovac could read with his fingers in the dark, because he had loaded 10,000 of them in his life. Base issue. Halloran point marking format. He stared at it for 4 seconds. And then Aaron Kovac lifted his head and looked up at the north ridgeline, where 30-plus prepared shooters were sitting in positions that covered the exact 2 pieces of cover his element would naturally have gone to on a routing that had been briefed at 11:40 that morning, in a room with a whiteboard, and the entire shape of the night rotated 90 degrees and locked into place. They had not been ambushed for being there. They had been ambushed for walking past something. And somebody had known where they'd be walking. "Senior," Marchetti's voice from 3 feet away. "Senior, what is it?" Kovac keyed his radio. He did not call command. He put it on the element net so that 11 men and nobody else would hear him. And he said, "Nobody transmits our position on the command net again. Not to anybody. Not for any reason. Do you copy?" There was a silence on the net of about 2 seconds. Then 11 voices came back one after another, and not one of them asked him why. That was the moment Kovac aged. At Wayne 57, the call went out from Halloran Point Tower to the operations floor that an unauthorized aircraft was rolling. At 1858, Captain Hartigan said a word that 3 watchstanders had never heard him say. Wayne Team 58 and Change Lieutenant Commander Curtis Meade turned toward the ramp windows with his headset in his hand, and for one single unguarded second before the concern came back onto his face before he said, "Who the hell is that?" before he became again the most reasonable man in the room. Meade's expression did something that Captain Hartigan happened to be looking directly at and did not understand for another 2 days. He looked frightened. Not the way a man looks when an aircraft launches into a storm. The way a man looks when something he has already priced out starts moving in a direction he did not price. And in the gorge, Marchetti heard it first. He heard it before it was anything he could name, a low pressure under the wind that arrived through the rock and up through his boots, rather than through his ears. And he said, "Do you hear that?" And Reyes said, "Hear what?" And then 8 seconds later, every man behind the western bulge heard it at once and knew exactly what it was. Kovac put his hand flat on Okonkwo's chest to feel it rise. It rose, barely, but it rose. And then his radio came alive on a frequency nobody had authorized, with a voice on it that was so level, so entirely unhurried, that it took him a full second to understand that what he was hearing was a live human being and not a recording. "Bravo 7 Storm 01, I have your grid, I have your problem, and I'm 3 minutes out. Get everyone flat faces down, hands over your ears, and Senior Chief, when I come through, do not look up." Kovac keyed his mic. His hand was shaking so badly he missed the button twice. "Storm 01, be advised, the throat is closed, the winds are—" "I know what the winds do in there," she said. "I walked it." She did not go to Ren Calloway with it. That was the hardest thing Marisol Duke did that night, and she did it on purpose because she had been in the Navy for 14 years, and she understood one thing about evidence with total clarity. The moment a restricted officer facing 4 charges touches a document, that document becomes a story about a restricted officer facing 4 charges. So at 0411, Duke printed everything, put it in a folder, walked across the base with it under her arm, and knocked on the door of Captain Edward Hartigan's quarters. Hartigan opened it in a T-shirt with his reading glasses pushed up on his head and a face that had not slept. AD-1. "Sir, I need 11 minutes, and I need you to not send me to my chain of command." Hartigan looked at the folder. "Come in." She laid it out on his table in the order she had found it, because she was a maintainer, and maintainers troubleshoot in sequence. 4 airframes, 4 sets of inspection signatures that Lieutenant Calloway had flagged 3 weeks ago, 4 extended maintenance windows, and then the second sheet. "Sir, this is the base vehicle log for those same 4 windows. Not aviation. Groundside. I pulled it because I wanted to see who was working when those signatures got made." Well, Hartigan put his glasses down. These are movements on the eastern shoulder, he said. Yes, sir. There's no road on the eastern shoulder. There is, sir, Duke said. It's just not on anything we publish. Hartigan sat down slowly. Sir, I want to be careful here because I'm a first-class petty officer, and I know exactly how far outside my lane I'm standing. But I've done this arithmetic 4 times, and it comes out the same every time. On 4 separate days, 4 aircraft were taken off the schedule on paper for maintenance they didn't need. On those same 4 days, base logistics vehicles made round trips up a road that doesn't exist to a place we can't see. And the man whose shop administers both of those systems is the man who buried Lieutenant Calloway's report about it and had her grounded 11 days later. Hartigan did not say anything for a long time. AD-1, he said finally, do you understand what happens to you if you're wrong? Yes, sir. Do you? Sir, 12 guys came home tonight because a woman I work for made a decision that's going to end her career, Duke said. I already know what it costs. I've been watching the price get paid all night. Hartigan picked up the vehicle log. Who else has seen this? Nobody. Then nobody else does, he said. Not Calloway, not the SEALs, not legal. You go back to your shop and you fix airplanes and you say nothing to anyone. And if anybody asks why you were pulling ledgers, you tell them the truth, which is that your maintenance officer told you to. Duke blinked. Sir, my maintenance officer didn't. He will have, Hartigan said, by 0600. 80730. The disciplinary board convened because the machine does not stop for anybody. It convened in a conference room with 11 people in it, and it convened on schedule, and Ren Calloway walked in wearing a service uniform for the first time in 19 days and sat down where she was told to sit. Lieutenant Commander Curtis Meade was in the second row. He had not slept either, and it showed on him the way it shows on a certain kind of man, not as exhaustion but as a slight extra polish, a little more attention to the shave and the collar. The compensating tidiness of somebody holding a shape together from the inside. He looked at Ren when she came in and gave her a small nod. Sympathetic, almost kind. She looked back at him for exactly as long as courtesy required and no longer, and she thought with a calm that surprised her, you sent me to Cape Alden. The charges were read: unauthorized operation of a naval aircraft, operation of an aircraft under maintenance hold, failure to obey a lawful order, 4 specifications, hazarding an aircraft. Lieutenant Calloway, the board president, said, do you contest any of the factual allegations? No, sir. None of them. No, sir. Every one of them happened. I did all of it. There was a small stir in the room because people expected defense and she had just refused to build one. Do you offer any explanation? Yes, sir. 12 men were in Ravenglass Gorge. The priority casualty had 6 to 9 minutes. The nearest authorized asset was 52, and I was the only person on this base who could get into that terrain. She kept her hands flat on the table. That's an explanation, sir. It's not an excuse. I'd like the board to write both of those down separately. Meade shifted in his seat, and then he did the thing he had come to do, and he did it beautifully. Sir, he said, if I may, as the operations officer, I want to speak in mitigation for the lieutenant. Every head turned. Commander, I don't want anyone in this room to think the staff is here to bury her. Meade's voice was warm and slightly rough. A man moved. What Lieutenant Calloway did last night was brave. It was also, I have to say honestly, the product of a pattern I've been concerned about for some time. A young officer with unusual gifts and a real difficulty accepting the constraints the rest of us operate inside. I flagged that concern 3 weeks ago. I flagged it in writing. He paused and his eyes went to Ren, and they were genuinely sad. I'd asked the board to consider that last night was not an aberration. It was the predictable outcome of a pattern that this command failed to correct in time. That's on us as much as her. It was masterful. In 90 seconds, he had recast the flight from heroism to symptom, established himself in the record as the man who saw it coming, explained the grounding retroactively, and done all of it while appearing to defend her. Ren sat there and understood that she was watching a man kill her career with sympathy, and that he was going to succeed, and that there was nothing she could say that wouldn't sound exactly like the pattern he had just described. The board president said, "Thank you, Commander." "No?" That's noted. And then the door opened. Senior Chief Aaron Kovac came in with his arm in a proper sling and 11 men behind him. Not 10, 11, because Reyes had gone to the clinic at 6 in the morning, and helped a corpsman put Danny Okonkwo in a wheelchair and rolled him across the base with an IV pole strapped to it, and Okonkwo was at the back, gray as ash, awake in there. The board president stood up. "Senior Chief, this is a closed proceeding." "Yes, sir, I'm aware." "You are not on the witness list." "No, sir, I asked to be, twice. Last night at 18 minutes past midnight, and again at 0600. Kovac did not move from the doorway. "Sir, I'm not going to make a scene, and I'm not going to disrupt your board. I'd just like to say 4 sentences and then I'll leave. And if you tell me no, I'll leave now, and I'll write them down instead and send them to every officer in the chain until somebody reads them." The president looked at Hartigan. Well, Hartigan, sitting at the end of the table, said, "Let him talk." Kovac came in 3 steps. "Yesterday morning at 11:40, Lieutenant Calloway walked into our brief and told us exactly what was going to happen in that gorge at what time and why. Nobody in this room asked her to do that. She wasn't invited, she wasn't qualified on paper, and she had absolutely nothing to gain by it." He looked at the row of chairs, at Meade. "She was told she was a taxi driver in a flight suit. People laughed. I was in that room and I heard the specificity of what she said, and I knew she'd been down in that terrain, and I didn't say a word because it was easier not to." His jaw worked. 8 hours later, I had my hand inside a man's leg." Somebody in the second row breathed out. "Sir, here's my 4 sentences. 12 of us walked into Ravenglass. 12 of us came out. Every regulation on that charge sheet is real, and I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't. But whatever this board decides, there are 12 men on this base who are going to spend the rest of their lives knowing exactly what she did and exactly what it cost her. And that doesn't go away when you close the folder." He reached into his pocket. He put a trident on the table in front of Ren Calloway. Not his own, an older one worn smooth, the kind a man carries for a specific reason he doesn't discuss. "I know that's not how it works," Kovac said. "I'm saying it anyway." He turned around and walked out, and 11 men went with him. And the last one out was Reyes pushing a wheelchair with Danny Okonkwo in it, and Okonkwo raised 2 fingers off the armrest as he passed Ren Calloway, and that was all he had the strength for, and it was enough. The room was very quiet. Ren looked at the trident on the table and did not touch it, and the board president was drawing a breath to speak when the door opened for a second time. Rear Admiral Margaret Ostrander was 61 years old and had arrived at 0340 on an aircraft nobody had been told to expect, and she had spent the intervening 5 hours reading. She did not sit down. "Take your seats," she said. "Captain Hartigan, is this board recorded?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good, keep it recording." She put a folder on the table. It was thin, and it had a cover sheet on it that 2 people in that room recognized and went slightly still. "Before this board goes any further," Ostrander said, "there's a factual defect in the record that I'm going to correct, and I want to be very clear that I'm correcting it because it's wrong, not because I have an opinion about the outcome." She looked at the board president. "Commander, you have Lieutenant Calloway's service record in front of you." "Yes, ma'am." "Read me her assignment history for the 26 months prior to her arrival at this command." The president looked down. Then he looked up. "Ma'am, there's a gap. It's coded. I don't have access to know." Ostrander said, "You don't." She opened the folder. "Lieutenant Ren Calloway is a qualified Naval Special Warfare Special Reconnaissance operator. She completed the pipeline at 22. She spent 26 months conducting ground reconnaissance in this theater before transferring into a joint close air support exchange program that this command was informed of by message traffic that I have now confirmed was received by the operations shop and never distributed." Nothing moved in that room. In the spring of the year before last, Lieutenant Calloway spent 11 consecutive nights on the floor of Ravenglass Gorge, conducting a terrain and pattern of life survey, alone on foot. She produced a product that is still the only human survey of that gorge that exists in the Department of the Navy, and I read all 61 pages of it between 0400 and 0700 this morning. She closed the folder. That is why she knew what the wind would do. Not because she'd flown it, because she'd stood in it with an instrument in her hand for 11 nights and written down what it did 81 times. Curtis Meade had gone the color of paper. Ren Calloway sat very still with her hands flat on the table and felt something in the room reorganize itself around her, and the feeling was not triumph. It was closer to grief, because she had kept it in a chart case in a supply annex for 2 years, And the reason she had kept it there was that it belonged to Teague, and now it was going to belong to a board. Ma'am, the president said, and his voice was not entirely under control, the charge sheet. The charge sheet stands, Ostrander said. Every specification on it is accurate, and every one of them stays in her record permanently. I'm not here to erase anything. I'm here to make sure that when this institution writes down what happened, it writes down all of it. She looked at Wren for the first time. Lieutenant, you have been sitting in a room for 40 minutes letting people build a narrative about an impulsive young officer, and you had a 61-page rebuttal in your own service jacket the entire time. Why didn't you say anything? Wren stood up because that seemed correct. Ma'am, the survey wasn't the point, she said. The point was that 12 guys were in a hole. If I'd have had to stand up and read my resume to get an airplane, they'd have died while I was reading it. She paused. And ma'am, respectfully, I shouldn't have needed a resume. That's the actual failure in this room. Everything I said in that brief yesterday morning was true, regardless of who said it. Ostrander held her eyes for a moment. That she said is the first accurate thing anybody has told me since I landed. The board recessed at 0906. It never reconvened. At 0910, Captain Hartigan asked Rear Admiral Ostrander for 11 minutes in a smaller room, and he brought a folder that a first-class petty officer had carried across a dark base at 0411, and he laid it out in the order she had laid it out for him. 4 airframes, 4 falsified maintenance windows, 4 sets of vehicle movements on a road that did not exist on any published product. Ma'am Hartigan said, I've spent 34 years believing that procedure exists because the alternative kills people. I still believe that. But I have to say this out loud because if I don't say it, I'll be saying it to myself for the rest of my life. He put his hand flat on the folder. Somebody used my procedures. Somebody took the exact system I've protected my entire career and turned it into a schedule. 4 days with no air coverage over that shoulder requested through the right channels, signed by the right people, logged correctly. Every single step of it defensible in isolation. Ostrander read for a while. And the report that would have caught it, she said, was submitted 3 weeks ago. By Calloway, to Meade. Yes, ma'am. And 11 days later, her flight logs were deleted out of a system Meade's shop administers, and she was grounded on a currency lapse. Yes, ma'am. Ostrander set the folder down. Captain, she said, in about 2 hours, I'm going to have to decide whether this is a criminal referral or a national level problem. Before I do that, I want you to tell me something, and I want you to tell me as a man and not as an air boss. She looked at him. If Ostrander had never landed, if that folder had never crossed your table, what would you have done to that lieutenant this morning? Hartigan did not flinch and did not soften it. I'd have ended her, he said, cleanly by the book, believing I was right, and I'd have gone home and slept. Thank you, Ostrander said. That's why I asked. At 1:40, a survey aircraft overflew the eastern face of Ravenglass Gorge. The terrace was empty, not abandoned, cleared, 19 containers, the fuel bladders, the truck, gone in under 15 hours off a road that did not exist in weather, that had only broken at dawn. Wren Calloway was in Hartigan's office when the imagery came in, and she looked at it for about 4 seconds and felt her stomach drop out. Ma'am, she said to Ostrander, somebody made a phone call. Yes. Between about 2100 last night and first light this morning, somebody in this building told them we had pod imagery of that terrace, and they moved 19 containers up a mountain road in the dark. She turned from the screen. That's not a leak. A leak is passive. That's an operator. That's somebody who knew what we had, knew how fast we'd move, and beat us by about 6 hours. Hartigan said quietly, AD-1 Duke logged the pod removal on paper at 2104. Commander Meade asked a second class about it at 2116. Wren turned all the way around. 12 minutes, she said, 12 minutes. And Wren Calloway sat down in a chair without being invited, which she had never done in her life, because the last piece had just landed, and it had landed hard. Sir, she said, ma'am, I want to say something, and I want to say it while it's still ugly in my mouth. She looked up. I set that up. I told Mari to log it in the open. I wanted him to know we had it because I wanted him to move fast and make a mistake. She swallowed. He did move fast. He made 0 mistakes, and 19 containers walked. Ostrander said, Lieutenant, no ma'am, let me finish it because it changes what we do next. Wren's voice was steady and her hands were not. I've been treating him like a coward with a spreadsheet, a man who buried a report to save his numbers. That's who I've had in my head for 3 weeks. But a coward doesn't clear a terrace in 15 hours in the dark. A coward doesn't look at my fuel state and pick 78 miles. She looked at Hardigan. He's not covering something up, sir. He's running something. There's a difference, and I got it wrong for 3 weeks, and it cost us the evidence. Nobody said anything. Then Ostrander said, how much of a difference, ma'am, an operation that can move 19 containers overnight isn't a man with debts. It's a network with a schedule, and a network with a schedule needs the same thing every time windows with no eyes on them. Wren stood back up. He built those windows out of maintenance paperwork, 4 of them that we know about. Ma'am, I'd like to know how many more are on the calendar. Hardigan was already reaching for a phone. Disastum. It took 40 minutes, not 4 windows, 9 going back 14 months, 9 sets of aircraft grounded on paper for maintenance that never happened on 9 days when base logistics vehicles made round trips up a road nobody had surveyed. 9 periods of no air coverage over the eastern shoulder of Ravenglass Gorge requested correctly, approved correctly, and logged correctly. And a 10th window already submitted, already approved, sitting in the system for the day after tomorrow. Hardigan read it twice. There's a patrol scheduled against it, he said. The room went entirely still. Say that again, sir, Wren said. There's a foot patrol on the calendar for the day after tomorrow. Eastern Rim and Lower Gorge, 12-man element. He looked up. It's Charlie Element. They're new in theater. They arrived Tuesday. Wren Calloway stood in the middle of that office and felt something happened to her that had not happened in 2 years, which was that the number came back. 4 minutes. It came back not as a memory and not as guilt, but as a piece of live information the way it had arrived on a hangar floor at 1853. The previous evening, oh, it's this one, and she heard herself speak before she had entirely decided to. Cancel it, she said. Lieutenant, sir, cancel the patrol. Right now, today. And then what? Hardigan said, and he was not arguing, he was asking. We cancel the patrol, they see the window close, and everything you just described goes into a hole for 6 months and comes back somewhere I can't see it. And in this meantime, the man who did it retires with a good record and a pension. Then I don't care, sir. You will. No, sir, I won't. Wren's voice finally moved the first time all night and all morning, and it moved maybe half a degree. I have been 4 minutes late, one time in my life. One time. There is a man's name I haven't said out loud in 2 years, and I'm not going to say it now. But I will tell you both that I have carried that number in my chest every single day since. And it is the entire reason I know what the wind does in that gorge, and I am not. She stopped and got it back and finished it flat and level. I am not going to let 12 more men walk down that road so we can watch who shows up. Ostrander had been silent for a long time. Lieutenant, she said, sit down. Wren sat. You just made an argument I agree with badly, Ostrander said. So let me make it correctly, and then I'm going to tell you why we're not going to do it. She leaned forward. You're right that we don't get to use 12 men as bait. That's not a close call, and I'd relieve any officer who tried it. But you've made an error, and it's the same error you made about Meade, and it's the error of a person who's been carrying a number for 2 years. Her eyes did not move. You've assumed the only 2 options are 12 men walk or nobody does. Wren looked up. Ma'am, Charlie Element doesn't go. That's decided. It was decided the second Captain Hardigan read the date. Ostrander tapped the sheet. But the window doesn't close. The routing stays in the system, the aircraft stay grounded on paper, and every piece of that schedule keeps looking exactly the way it looked yesterday. Nobody at this command is told otherwise. Nobody. Hardigan said slowly, Ma'am, if the window stays open, they run the move. Yes. And there's nobody on that ground. There will be, Ostrander said, if the right people volunteer, and if there is a pilot who can get into that gorge in the dark, in weather without lights, without being heard until it's too late to matter. Wren Calloway sat in that chair and felt everything in her go very quiet. Ma'am, she said, I can get in. I know you can. I read 61 pages of why. Ostrander stood. What I don't know, and I want you to think before you answer, because I'm going to hold you to it, is whether you can do it in an airframe that took blast damage last night on an engine that this command hasn't cleared with a man in this building who has already tried once to put you in the water. And Wren Calloway said, Ma'am, that last part isn't a complication. That's the whole reason it works. Ostrander raised an eyebrow. Explain. Because he thinks I'm finished. Wren stood up. He watched me get read 4 charges this morning. He watched a board convene. Whatever else he knows the grounded lieutenant is grounded, and he knows the only airplane on this base that can fly the throat is sitting on the North Hardstand under a mishap seal with a hole in the nacelle. She looked at Hardigan. Sir, I need that seal to stay on. I need everybody on this base, including my own maintainers, to believe that airplane is dead. And I need one person to know it isn't. Hardigan said, Duke. Duke, Wren said. And sir, she's going to have to sign us something false to do it. I'm not asking you for that. I'm telling you it's what I'm about to ask her for. And if she says no, I'll find another way. And if she says yes, I want it on your desk in writing that you knew before she did it. Hardigan looked at her for a long moment. Lieutenant, he said, yesterday morning I'd have relieved you for that sentence. Yes, sir. This morning I'm going to write it down. He picked up a pen. Go ask her. No. Wren found Marisol Duke under the left wing of an impounded aircraft at 12:14 doing nothing because there was nothing she was permitted to do. Mari, ma'am, Duke did not look up. You're not supposed to be within 50 feet of this jet. I know. There's a seal on it. I know. Duke straightened up and looked at her, and something in Wren's face made her set down the rag. Okay, she said. What? 38 hours from now. I need this airplane to fly at night at low level into Ravenglass, and I need every record in this building to say it never left the hardstand. Wren said it without softening any of it. That means the seal stays on the paperwork and comes off the airplane. That means you sign a status board that isn't true. That means if this goes wrong, you don't get to be the maintainer who did the right thing. You get to be the maintainer who falsified a mishap seal, and every good thing you've done in 14 years gets read in that light. Duke stood there. Ma'am, she said, is there another way? Yes, 3 of them. All of them take longer than 38 hours. And in 38 hours, a window opens over that shoulder that somebody built out of your maintenance system, Wren said. 9 times before this, every one of them, there was nobody watching. This time there's going to be somebody watching. Duke looked up at the airplane. Then she said the thing that Wren Calloway would carry with her longer than the trident on the table, longer than the 61 pages, longer than any of it. Ma'am, 3 weeks ago, you walked into a maintenance office with a folder and told a commander that 4 of my airframes had been signed off by a man who was on leave. Duke picked the rag back up. You did that knowing it might land on me, and it did land on me. I got interviewed twice. I got looked at sideways for a month. And not one time did you come to me and ask me to make it easier for you. She wiped her hands. I've been fixing your airplane for 2 years, she said. Tell me what time you want the chocks pulled. 38 hours is not a long time to rebuild an airplane, and it is an even shorter time to rebuild a man's understanding of himself. And both of those things happened at Halloran Point over the next day and a half. Duke did the airplane in the open, which was the only way to do it. She kept the mishap seal on the paperwork, and she kept the aircraft on the status board as down, and then she pulled the nacelle panel in broad daylight with 2 of her own people and told anybody who asked that she was documenting damage for the investigation, which was true. She documented every bit of it. She also replaced a hydraulic line, reseated a bleed valve, ran a compressor wash, and swapped the thermal sensor that had spent 11 days telling a lie one time in 6. At 19:30, on the second day, she ran the left engine for 11 minutes with the aircraft chained down and a fire bottle beside her and her own hand on the temperature readout, and it stayed exactly where it should have stayed, and Marisol Duke put her forehead against the fuselage for about 2 seconds and then went and washed her face. Kovac did the ground side. That took 4 hours of arguing, and it was Ostrander he argued with, not Hardigan, because Ostrander was the one who had said the sentence, if the right people volunteer, and Kovac had decided to hold her to every word of it. Ma'am, you're not putting Charlie Element down there. No. And you're not sending my guys either, because half of them are on quarters and one of them's got a repaired femoral. Correct. Then who's walking that terrace? I was rather hoping, Ostrander said, that you were about to volunteer 4 men and yourself. Ma'am, I've got 1 arm. You've got 1 arm in 11 years, and the only element in this theater that has actually been shot at from those ridge lines, Ostrander said. I'm not asking you to fast rope. I'm asking you to be the man on the ground who knows what the ground did to him. Kovac stood there. Then he said, "Ma'am, permission to say something that's going to sound like I'm negotiating." "Go." "I want Marchetti." Ostrander looked at him. "He's 23, ma'am. He's got 7 months on the team, and 2 nights ago he counted his rounds out loud from 14 down to 11 and didn't know he was doing it." Kovac's voice was flat. "If I leave him behind on this one, he's going to spend the next 30 years wondering whether anybody thought he was worth bringing. I'm not doing that to him. He carried Danny 30 feet. He's coming. Does he want to come?" "Ma'am," Kovac said, "he's been standing outside this building for an hour and a half waiting to be asked." Eli Marchetti was asked at 21:40 and said yes before the sentence finished, and then went and sat down in a passageway by himself for 10 minutes with his hands on his knees, which Kovac saw and did not interrupt. Danny Okonkwo found out at 2200 because Reyes told him, and Okonkwo made 3 separate attempts to get out of a hospital bed on a leg that had been opened 48 hours earlier before a corpsman half his size put a hand on his chest and told him to knock it off. "I'm not asking to go," Okonkwo said. "I'm asking to be in the room." "Which room?" "Whatever room they're in when it's happening. Any room. I don't care if it's a broom closet with a radio." He got the room. Hartigan authorized it personally, which was not a thing air bosses do. And at 0100, on the night of the window, Danny Okonkwo was in a chair in the corner of the operations floor with a leg elevated on a crate and a headset on, doing absolutely nothing except being there.
Yes, sir.
Curtis Meade spent those 38 hours being helpful. That was the part that got under everybody's skin afterward. He did not go quiet. He did not hedge. He did not start building distance. He came to work early both days. He assisted the mishap investigation. He personally routed 3 documents that made Ren Calloway's charge sheet slightly worse, and he did it with visible reluctance. And twice he said out loud in the hallway that this whole thing was a tragedy and that she'd been failed by the command. At 1730, on the second day, he submitted a leave request for the following week. Hartigan approved it within the hour because denying it would have told him everything. And at 23:20, 42 minutes before the window opened, Curtis Meade drove out to the north side of the field and stood on the ramp for a while looking at an A-10 that was sitting exactly where it had been sitting since the night of the ambush, with a seal on the canopy rail and a red tag on the ladder and a maintenance stand parked beside it. He looked at it for about 90 seconds. Then he got back in his vehicle and drove away, and he did not know, nobody could have known standing where he stood, that the seal on that canopy rail had been cut and re-glued by a first-class petty officer 11 hours earlier, and that there were 400 gallons of fuel in an airplane the status board said was empty. Marisol Duke watched him from inside a darkened hangar the entire time, with her radio off and her heart going like a hammer. When his taillights cleared the gate, she keyed the handheld once. "Ma'am," she said, "he came and looked." "How long in 90 seconds? Did he touch it?" "No." Ren Calloway, sitting in the back of the truck in flight gear with a chart on her knees, closed her eyes for 1 second. "Then he still thinks it's dead," she said. "Pull the chocks at 0015. The window opened at 00 Zen. At 06, a base logistics vehicle departed the fuel farm on a routing that was correctly submitted, correctly approved, and correctly logged, and turned east. At 0011, a second vehicle followed it. Kovac's element was already on the eastern shoulder, 4 men and a senior chief with one arm sitting in rock that Ren Calloway had marked on a chart 2 years earlier with a symbol that meant cover for 4. They had walked in from a drop 3 miles out, which had taken them 5 hours, and they had not used a light one time. At 0050, Marisol Duke pulled the chocks on an aircraft that officially did not exist in the dark, with the ramp lights off, and stood back and did not wave. 80022, Ren Calloway took off from Halloran Point with no clearance for the second time in 3 days, and this time everybody who mattered knew. Storm 01 airborne. Ostrander on the operations floor said, "Copy Storm 01. And Danny Okonkwo, in a chair in the corner with his leg on a crate, said nothing at all and did not take his eyes off the speaker. The thing nobody had planned for went wrong at 0041. Kovac's voice came up quiet and fast on the element net, and Ren heard it 11 miles out. "Storm 01 Bravo. We've got a problem. There's a third vehicle. It came up behind the other 2 6 minutes back, no lights. Copy third vehicle. It's not a truck, it's a passenger vehicle, and it's ours." A pause. "Ma'am, that's a staff sedan." Wren's hands did not move on the controls. Bravo, say again the last. There is a base staff sedan on the Eastern Service Road at 041, and it just parked on the terrace and one individual got out. And on the operations floor, Captain Edward Hartigan turned around very slowly and said to a room of 11 people, "Where is Commander Meade?" Nobody answered. I asked where he is. The duty officer was already typing. Sir, he badged out of the main gate at 2340. In what? Sir, in a government vehicle. He signed one out at 2331. The duty officer looked up and his face was doing something. Sir, he signed it out for a fuel farm inspection. Hartigan put both hands on the back of a chair. He's not running, he said. He's not on a plane out of here next week with a bag. He's on that terrace right now in person at 1 in the morning doing the load himself. Sir, why would he? Because he's short a truck, Ostrander said, and everyone turned. 19 containers came off that terrace in 15 hours 2 nights ago, in the dark and the weather. That's not a thing you do cleanly. He lost capacity doing it. Tonight he's got 2 vehicles where he needs 3, and there's a window that closes at 0400, and the only person left he can trust to drive the third one is himself. She looked at the speaker on the wall. He's not being reckless, she said. He's being cornered. Storm 01, did you copy all that? Storm 01 copies. Lieutenant, listen to me carefully. There is now a United States naval officer on that objective. If this goes loud, that changes everything about what we're doing and what it means onward. Do you understand me? Rajamashtam. And Ren Calloway said, Ma'am, with respect, it changes nothing about tonight. There's a man on that terrace loading a truck, and there's 12 guys on a calendar for the next window and the one after that. I'm going in. Storm 01. Ma'am, you can order me off. I'll come off. But you have to say it now because in 90 seconds I'm in the throat and I'm not going to be able to hear you. There was a silence on the operations floor of about 3 seconds that 11 people would remember for the rest of their careers. Storm 01, Ostrander said, you are cleared and hot. She went into Ravenglass Gorge for the 3rd time in her life at 0044 in the dark with no lights at 400 feet and 240 knots. The pulse was there. It was always there. She took the second bend with left rudder and forward pressure and came out of the bulge, level and low. And she did not think about it at all this time. And that was the strangest part, that the thing which had once cost her 4 days of study and 11 nights on a gorge floor now happened somewhere below the level of her attention, the way you go down a staircase in your own house in the dark. She came up the gorge instead of across it. That was the piece of it. Nobody at Halloran Point would have thought of, and it was the piece that came off 11 nights of walking. She came up the floor below the terrace from the mouth, which meant that the sound of her arrived at the terrace from directly beneath and behind off rock, at the exact angle where the gorge's own acoustics turned an A-10 into something that could not be located until it was already there. She had written that down 2 years ago. Page 41. The first thing anybody on that terrace knew was that the world came apart underneath them. She did not shoot the vehicles. She shot the road. 2 bursts, 4 seconds total in the Eastern Service Road, the one that did not exist on any published product. The one that a man had used 9 times in 14 months stopped being a road for about 80 meters below the terrace and about 110 above it. Then she was past and climbing out and calling it. Bravo Storm 01. Road's gone, both ends. Nobody's driving off that terrace tonight. And Kovac from 300 meters away in the rocks with 4 men and 1 working, arm said Storm 01 Bravo moving, and stood up. It took 11 minutes. There were 6 individuals on that terrace, and 4 of them put their hands out immediately because 4 of them were laborers who had been paid in cash and had absolutely no interest in dying for a container of anything. One of them ran for the north end of the terrace where the road used to be and stopped when he reached the place where the road used to be. The 6th one did not do anything at all. Curtis Meade was standing beside the open door of a government sedan with a manifest in his hand when Aaron Kovac came up over the lip of the terrace with a rifle in his one good arm and 4 men behind him. He did not run. He did not reach for anything. He stood there and he looked at Kovac and he did something that Kovac said afterward was the single worst thing he had ever watched a human being do. He put on the smile. Senior Chief, he said, thank God. This is an unsecured site we need to. Sir, I came out here because the vehicle log showed movement on a route that shouldn't have. Sir, Kovac's voice did not rise. You've got a manifest in your hand. Meade looked down at it, and for about a second and a half the shape came off him. It came off all at once the way it does, and what was underneath was a 44-year-old man on a rock ledge at 1 in the morning who had run out of rooms to be reasonable in. You don't understand what this is, he said. No, sir, I don't. It's containers, Senior Chief. It's not, nobody was ever supposed to. He stopped. He started again and his voice went up. I moved a schedule. That's what I did. I moved 4 maintenance windows on a piece of paper, and no one was ever supposed to be near that gorge. And then some idiot at the staff put a patrol on a route I didn't build, and I tried. You tried, Kovac said. I told them it was covered. I told them the eastern approach was covered. Meade's hands were open now. I didn't know they'd be there. I didn't. You knew at 11:40 in the morning, Kovac said. A lieutenant walked into that room and told you exactly where we'd be and exactly what would happen, and you looked her in the face and you called her a taxi driver, and 8 hours later I had my hand inside Danny Okonkwo's leg. Meade said Aaron, and Aaron Kovac said the only thing he said above a conversational volume that entire night. Don't, he let it hang. Sir, he said when he had it back, you're going to put the manifest on the hood and you're going to put your hands on the hood next to it and you're going to do it right now because there are 4 men behind me who carried a stretcher out of this gorge 2 nights ago, and I would rather they didn't have to look at you any longer than necessary. Curtis Meade put the manifest on the hood. 19 containers had walked 2 nights earlier. 22 did not walk that night, along with a manifest 2 vehicles, a government sedan, and 6 individuals, 4 of whom talked before sunrise. The road was gone at both ends, which meant everything on that terrace stayed on that terrace until a lift crew came for it at first light, which meant a chain of custody, so clean that a prosecutor 3 months later described it in open court as the tidiest evidence recovery he had seen in 19 years. Ren Calloway landed at Halloran Point at 01:56 with fuel to spare on 2 engines that both ran cool, and this time the tower answered on the first call. Storm 01 Halloran Tower cleared to land runway 08 wind 260 at 9. A pause, and then Petty Officer Adam Voss, who had 2 nights earlier told a senior officer no, into a live recorder added entirely against procedure. Welcome back, ma'am. She taxied to the North Hard stand and shut down. Marisol Duque was standing under the wing before the canopy was fully up, and she had a rag in her hands that she was not using and had not used the entire time the aircraft was gone. Ma'am, she ran cool, Ren said. I know she ran cool. I know exactly how cool she ran. I've been sitting on the readout for. Duke stopped, and her mouth went sideways, and she said, Ma'am, permission to go be a person somewhere for 5 minutes. Granted. Duque went and was a person behind a maintenance stand for about 4 minutes, and Ren Calloway stood under the wing of an aircraft. She was not authorized to fly and let her, and did not follow, and did not say anything about it afterward ever. Here is what it can because it costs something, and any story that says otherwise is lying to you. The charges stayed. All 4 specifications from the first night went into Lieutenant Ren Calloway's record permanently with findings, and they will be there when she is a commander, and they will be there when she retires. Unauthorized operation of a naval aircraft, operation under maintenance hold, failure to obey, hazarding an aircraft. Nobody erased a single word of it, and Ren never asked anybody to. Ma'am, I'd rather it stayed, she told Ostrander in an office on the 4th morning. If it goes away, then what it says is that it's fine to do what I did as long as you're right, and it's not fine. It's necessary sometimes, and it's never fine, and those 2 things have to sit next to each other in writing, or the next person reads it wrong. Ostrander said, You realize this ends your competitiveness for command. Yes, ma'am. You realize you will never receive a public decoration for any of this because the classification level on that terrace means none of it exists. Yes, ma'am. You realize that the 12 men who know what you did are the only 12 people who will ever know. And Ren Calloway said, Ma'am, 12 was always the number. That's the whole number. That's all I was ever doing. The second night, the terrace, the road, the man on the ledge never appeared in any record at all. Officially, that aircraft did not fly. Officially, Marisol Duque's status board was accurate. Ostrander looked at that problem for a long time and then buried it under a classification that meant it would be reviewed by nobody for 50 years. and she wrote a private memorandum for the file that said in one sentence that the decision was hers and that no enlisted maintainer had exercised any judgment for which she should ever be accountable. Duke never saw that memo. Hartigan told her about it 4 years later at a retirement, and Marisol Duke had to leave the room. Curtis Meade pleaded out 11 months later. The number that came up in the sentencing memorandum, the thing everyone wants at the end. The why turned out to be $416,000 accumulated over 3 years. Most of it, not even his, a brother-in-law's business. A guarantee he'd signed at a kitchen table in 2019 because it seemed like a small thing to do for family. He had told himself and he told the court that no one was ever supposed to be near that gorge. Aaron Kovac attended one day of the proceedings and left at the lunch recess and did not come back. Danny Okonkwo walked out of the Halloran Point Medical Facility 11 weeks later on a cane with a leg he kept and a limp. He would not lose. There was no ceremony. Nobody organized it. Everybody came anyway, which is the only way anything real ever gets organized. Kovac with his arm out of the sling and not yet right, Marchetti in a t-shirt. Reyes, the rest of Bravo Duke, and a corpsman who had held a hand on his chest at 2200 and told him to knock it off. His wife was there. Junie was 4 and did not understand any of it and understood the important part completely, which is a thing 4-year-olds are better at than adults. Ren Calloway came without telling anyone and stood at the back. Okonkwo saw her over the top of about 9 people and stopped walking. "You came," he said. "I wanted to see you walk out." He looked down at the cane. Then he did something faintly ridiculous and entirely sincere. He held it out to the side off the ground and stood on his own repaired leg for about 4 seconds. "There," he said. "Now you've seen it." Junie looked up at the woman in the olive t-shirt with the dark blonde ponytail and asked the question children ask. "Who are you?" Okonkwo put his hand on his daughter's head. "That's the one who came," he said. Junie thought about it with total seriousness. "Did you come in an airplane?" Ren crouched down. "I did." "Was it scary?" "A little," Ren said, "but I knew the way." Junie nodded satisfied because that made sense to her, the way true things make sense to children before they learn to complicate them. And then she went off to look at a dog. Okonkwo looked at Ren over the top of everybody. "A little," he said, "maybe more than a little." He laughed and it came out of him, unguarded and surprised. And behind him, Kovac and Marchetti looked at each other and neither of them said one single word. The program was stood up 6 months later, under a classification that kept its name out of every public document. It was small, 14 people across 4 commands, each of them assigned a piece of ground that nobody flew and nobody surveyed, with a charter, a budget line standing authority, and one very specific instruction written into the founding document by Rear Admiral Margaret Ostrander herself. The operational judgment of the designated specialist is presumed sufficient and does not require relitigation at the time of employment. Which meant, in plain English, that the next time somebody like Ren Calloway said the gorge closes at 1700, the room had to start from the assumption that she was right. She was the first assignment. The paperwork on it was signed by Captain Edward Hartigan, who had 90 days earlier sat at the end of a table fully prepared to end her, and who said exactly one thing to her when he handed it over. "Lieutenant, I want to tell you what I got wrong because if I do not say it out loud, I'll spend the rest of my life explaining it to myself." He kept his hand on the folder. "I spent 34 years believing that procedure protects people. It does. I still believe it. What I never once considered, not once in 34 years, is that a procedure only protects people if there's someone in the room willing to be a pain in the ass about it." He slid the folder across. "You were the pain in the ass. I called it a discipline problem. It was the safety system working, and I was the failure in it." Ren took the folder. "Sir," she said, "you sealed the tower tapes at 0400 on the worst night of my life when everything you knew said I was the problem. That's the only reason any of the rest of it happened." Hartigan almost smiled. "Go learn some ground, Lieutenant." Duh. She flew out of Halloran Point on a Tuesday morning with a chart case in the seat beside her and a heading that took her northeast toward a range of terrain 300 miles out that had 11 pages of notes on it and needed 60. Somewhere behind her, a trident sat in the bottom of that chart case wrapped in a cloth where it had been since a senior chief put it on a table and said, "I know that's not how it works." And somewhere much further back than that, 2 years in a lifetime, there was a man named Teague whose name Wren Calloway had not said out loud since the day she was 4 minutes late. She said it that morning, out loud in the cockpit, alone once. And then she put her hands on the controls and turned toward a ground that nobody had learned yet. So that the next time the weather closed and the radios went quiet, and 12 people ended up somewhere the maps called impossible, the answer to who could get to them would already be written down in her handwriting on a chart she had walked before she ever flew it. She had gone in once because nobody else could. She spent the rest of her life making sure that was never the reason again.